one challenge confronting the social sciences from the perspective of their scientific character, as we've discussed in previous lectures, is that the subject matter that they attempt to explain incorporates value judgments. And that's a challenge because if you're trying to do more than describe phenomena, if you're actually trying to explain phenomena, then how do you explain why people make the value judgments that they do? That seems to be beyond the purview of science as it had been conceived from the 17th through the 19th century. Science was descriptive and explanatory with regard to matter and energy, but when it came to trying to explain value judgments, that seemed to get into all these questions of free will and determinism and motives, etc. And so that becomes one problem that the social sciences have to deal with, namely that their subject matter incorporates value judgments. A second challenge that the social sciences have to deal with is methodological objectivity, in the sense that when you are studying material that incorporates value judgments, then is it really possible to take a neutral methodological stance and merely collect data and attempt to explain it? For example, if you are studying a totalitarian state from the perspective of a political scientist or an anthropologist or a sociologist, can you simply explain why torture is being used without taking a position that this is wrong? So that there's a methodological challenge that to somehow run along a very narrow line between being scientific and neutral about the material that you're studying and having an agenda with regard to that material, having a kind of a reform agenda with regard to that material. Now, of course, from the perspective of the postmodernist that we discussed in a previous lecture, physical science also has an agenda, and it is also an interpretation of nature, not a uniquely correct description and explanation of natural phenomena. But, of course, the physical scientists contest this. So anthropologists, political scientists, sociologists, historians, economists all have these two challenges to contend with, because in all of those cases, their subject matter is valuational, and they also have there is a strong tendency to have an agenda with regard to the material, to have an attitude, to personally have value judgments about the subject matter that you're studying. This seems not to be a problem that non-clinical psychologists have to cope with. That is, a psychological theorist can describe human behavior without necessarily taking a judgmental position with regard to, with regard to that behavior, though we'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture. But archaeologists and linguists would seem to be free of this problem. The archaeologists, because they are studying the way people have lived, do not have to take a judgmental, or are not tempted to take a judgmental position with regard to it insofar as interpreting their work. And linguists typically do not have judgmental attitudes towards the languages that they study. And in this lecture, we're going to be talking about linguistics. Modern linguistics can be said, I think, in a significant way, to begin with the work of Ferdinand de Saussure in the first decade of the 20th century. De Saussure not only influenced many subsequent intellectuals, and not just linguists, but he also changed the direction of linguistics. 18th century linguistics was interested in the origin of language. 19th century linguistics was interested in the historical development of language. And it was really in the 19th century that we see the origin of a science devoted to collecting lots of languages. We see collection as an important motif in 19th century study of nature and culture generally, collecting lots of languages and studying them in their historical development. Not surprisingly, in the second half of the 19th century, there was an evolutionary interpretation of this historical development. After Darwin, it made a lot of sense to see languages as evolving over time And it was also the case that 19th century linguists saw languages as systems. That is, that a language had a coherent structure. And an analogy here was drawn with the work of Georges Cuvier, a French biologist of the turn of the 19th century, who was responsible for the first reconstruction of extinct animals from bones that were found, that were being dug up. For example, saber-toothed tigers and later dinosaurs. How from a selection of a non-representative selection of bones can you reconstruct the original animal? And Cuvier developed a formula that assumed that all the different parts of the skeleton are coordinated with one another. That if you have a hip bone of a certain size, that it implies a thigh bone of a certain size, that it implies, etc. So that there's a certain systemic character to a skeleton. And so 19th century linguists were historically oriented. They tended to look at the history as an evolutionary development, and that languages had a systemic character. As a young man, de Saussure made his mark in linguistics by predicting the existence of a vowel in an extinct language that had never been found in written records that survived, that reflected that language. And subsequently, he was proven correct. He predicted that given the structure of this language, there must be such a vowel, even though we've never seen it in the fragmentary records that have survived, and that vowel was subsequently discovered. This is an example of what it means to take a language as a system. Right? If it's a system and there's a missing piece, you should be able to say, well, something has to fit in this. It's like a jigsaw puzzle with one piece missing. You can identify what that piece has to be like from the space that is left empty. In 1906, de Saussure was asked to teach a general course in linguistics, or a course in general linguistics, rather than the specific languages that he was interested in doing research in. And over a period of 5 years, he taught this course 3 times. Then, unfortunately, he became ill and died. But in 1916, 2 of his students collected the notes from other students who had sat through those lectures and published a small seminal book called The Course in General Linguistics by Ferdinand de Saussure. He did not, in fact, write that book. It was put together by his students. And this is the book that really, in some sense, can be said to begin the modern linguistics, but it is also very important to us because what de Saussure announced, quite surprisingly, I think, to his students at the time, because there was not much of a hint of this in his earlier work, was a theory of language as a closed system of relationships. De Saussure argued that the focus of linguistics should not be on historical development. It should be, which is called diachronics in language. It's the study of languages over time, but synchronics. Take a language as it is and try to understand its structure, and in particular, where do meanings come from? Where does the meaning of the word cat come from? Classically, it was thought in some intuitive way that that the meaning of cat has something to do with a feline out there that you could point to ostensibly and say, cat. Now, what de Saussure argued, and initially this may sound strange, but in fact it makes quite a good deal of sense once you've thought about it some more, is that all linguistic meanings and all linguistic values, which is associated with the way that we understand and interpret the sounds that we hear in a language, all linguistic meanings and values derive from relationships among the sounds and signs of a language. They have nothing whatsoever to do with what language refers to. That the meaning of the word cat is strictly a function of the relationship between the sound cat and all of the other sounds that you can make in the English language. And that's what we learn. As we acquire a language, we learn the rules, so to speak, for those relationships, or we get a feeling for that network of relationships, and then we make the appropriate sounds in order to achieve the objectives that we have when we speak. So for de Saussure, a language is a network of relationships. It is a closed network of relationships in the sense that no word has a meaning because of anything outside language. Now, it is, of course, a fact that people use languages to refer to what is beyond language, but that is irrelevant to understanding why a sound in a language has the meaning that it does. For that, you have to understand the network of relationships that sound has to all the other sounds in the language. This should sound similar to us to the very bizarre notion in the general theory of relativity that the mass of an object is, in a certain sense, a function of the total distribution of mass in the universe, which we saw back in the second lecture when we talked about the general theory of relativity. Einstein made mass not an absolute thing, but a name for a certain kind of a relationship. And so the mass of an object is directly and indirectly a result of the way that object fits into the total system of objects in the universe. Analogously, de Saussure is saying, although he did not get it from, he said this before the general theory was published. That's what's revealing about this. This is an idea, so to speak, in the air, that the meanings and values of the language are a function of internal relationships. That's what it means to say that a language is a closed system of relationships, a closed network of relationships. I'm using system and network almost synonymously here. For de Saussure, a language was a social fact. And here we see something that we're going to come upon when we talk in a later lecture about sociology, an echo of the ideas of Émile Durkheim, the great French founder of modern sociology. Durkheim considered society to be a reality, not as a thing, of course, but a reality in the sense that social relationships could exert forces on us, that we behave in the way that we do in a society because we are not physically forced to do one thing rather than another, but we behave in that way because society, we have internalized relationships that cause us to behave one way rather than another, to dress one way in one context and one way in another context. And we do that because we have internalized social forces, so to speak. Analogously, de Saussure thought that language was a social fact that caused us to behave in the way that we do linguistically. So it had a social reality that we acquired, that we internalized as infants and as children, through which we recognized the appropriate relationships among sounds, so that we speak English, we speak Swahili, we speak Hindi, whatever language whatever language represents the social fact that we have internalized. For de Saussure, the focus of linguistics, therefore, was on semantics, on the meanings of words, as opposed to syntax, grammatical rules. Of course, syntax is important, the grammatical rules are important, but what de Saussure thought that linguists needed to explain primarily was semantics. And for him, semantics was, as I've said before, a function of the closed network of relationships that were associated with a language. This is also very similar to the contemporary ideas of David Hilbert about mathematics, you remember, as a closed system. Remember Hilbert's formalist interpretation of mathematics, that mathematics was a closed system of logical relationships. So again, we have in the early 1900s, the first decade or decade and a half of the 20th century, we have in a number of fields the idea emerging that truth, that mass, that language is a closed network of relationships, and we don't need to specify things or absolute entities in order to explain truth, mass, linguistic meaning. Those can derive from networks of relationships. So de Saussure's ideas were broadcast and became quite influential. Contemporaneously in the United States, the figure of Franz Boas, emerges as an important intellectual influence. And we've seen Boas as an influence in anthropology, and he'll be back as an influence in sociology. Boas, in the first third of the 20th century, was extremely influential in linguistics because of his relativist cultural perspective. And he was among the first to start studying languages other than the classical and Romance languages. And he focused on American Indian languages and sent his students out to study American Indian languages, carrying with them the same set of values that he promoted in anthropology, namely respect for the integrity of each cultural entity in its own right. Two of his students, so to speak, his intellectual students, Benjamin Whorf and Edward Sapir, formulated a hypothesis consistent with Boas's work, influenced by Boas, that each language represents a certain way of experiencing the world. It's not just, by the way, that the French make these noises and the Germans make these noises and then Navajo make those noises, but that each language reflects a certain way of experiencing the world, which, by the way, causes a heck of a lot of grief for translators, because you can't then translate one language into another directly, because you're really translating one way of experiencing the world into another. And so in one language, verbs may be more important than nouns. In another language, time endings may be more important than in another language. And so it's very difficult. You can't just translate one language to another if the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is correct. So one line of Boas's influence was the Sapir-Whorf line, which in the 1920s and 30s was quite influential, that languages are capsulated in a sense that they represent encapsulated ways of experiencing the world. To really understand Navajo, you have to learn it so that you experience the world as the Navajo do, and the Eskimo do, etc. The famous myth that the Eskimos have a huge number of words for snow, and of course the Navajo would not have that many words for snow, but that turns out to be a bit of a myth. Another intellectual student of Boas's was Leonard Bloomfield, who was responsible for shifting the focus of language in a typically American way to empirical studies that were descriptive. So he looked upon language as a primarily psychological phenomenon, not a social phenomenon. He looked at language from a psychological perspective, relating it to, in the 1930s, the growing influence of behaviorism and behavioral psychology, and adopting the methods of behavioral psychology to simply describe the way languages are used. And that turned out to be an extremely influential line of thought, because from this behavioral perspective came what's called American descriptivist linguistics, which is what it sounds like, descriptivism. Descriptivism moved into structuralism, that is to say, trying to understand the structural rules that guide users in speaking a language. What are the underlying structural rules for the language? And that led to, as we will see in a few minutes, that led to the work of Noam Chomsky, perhaps in linguistics, Chomsky is to linguistics in the second half of the 20th century, what Einstein was to physics in the first half of the 20th century. But before we do that, I need to bring in another line that turned out to converge on Chomsky, and that is, between 1925 and 1950, an extremely influential linguistic school emerged in Prague, in what was then called Czechoslovakia. And the Prague School of Linguistics was a functionalist school of linguistics. It was based on the idea that what a linguist needed to study was the relationships among the functional elements of a language, identifying what the functional elements of a language were, nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, and then the relationships among those elements. So how does a language function? Don't worry about what a language is. Don't worry about what, from a de Saussure perspective, trying to understand the individual elements of a language, what they are, the sounds. Forget that. Just look at how they function. So it's like the difference between knowing theoretically the thermodynamics of a car engine and being able to fix one. So the functionalist perspective, and we're going to see in sociology that this is very important, a very important school. The functionalist perspective was the center of Prague linguistics, and in the late 1940s, early 1950s, American descriptivism, which had morphed into structuralism. And one of the most eminent practitioners of structuralist linguistics was Zelig Harris at the University of Pennsylvania, who founded, in fact, the first department of linguistics in an American university at the University of Pennsylvania. Zelig Harris was an eminent structural linguist. One of his students was the brilliant young Noam Chomsky, who in 1951, having graduated from Penn and moved to Harvard as a research fellow for 4 years, where he heard and interacted with Roman Jakobson, who was one of the leaders of the Prague School of Linguistics. And Chomsky synthesized in his own innovative way the work of Jakobson and American descriptivist structuralist linguistics, so that he in some sense stands in the descriptivist structuralist tradition, influenced by Jakobson, and in 1957 published a portion of his doctoral dissertation as a book called Syntactic Structures, which almost immediately made him the center of linguistic activity in the United States and subsequently internationally. Chomsky's influence redirected linguistics in the same way that de Saussure's did, but in a different direction. Chomsky, curiously, Chomsky holds that language has nothing intrinsic to do with communication. Chomsky is not interested at all in semantics. He's only interested in syntactics, in the rules that guide language. Chomsky is wildly anti-behavioral. His 1959 review of Skinner's book, Verbal Behavior, was one of the things that undermined behaviorism at the peak of its influence, showing that Skinner's theory of language was nonsensical, and using a very simple illustration, namely that a child does not simply learn to mimic sounds, that at a certain age a child can form an indefinitely large number of sentences that they never heard. That at a certain age, somewhere around 2 to 3 years old, a child gets it and can formulate sentences that they have never heard. So behaviorism is incapable of explaining language acquisition, and Skinner, who was no linguist, Skinner had the arrogance to publish a book on language acquisition, which Chomsky demolished. So he's anti-behaviorist. He was anti-semantics. He was anti-Boasian because he said, no, it is not the case that each language is an encapsulated way of experiencing the world. There is not a plurality of languages in the world. That is an illusion created by what he called performance, the way people actually make noises with their mouths. What he was interested in was competence, linguistic competence, and that he claimed was universal. That underlying our speech was a hardwired competency, a biological capability, a neurological capability that is linguistic, and that therefore all languages at the surface are really one language deep down. That if we understood the neurological logic of language, the neurologic of language, the language competence, then we would be able to intertranslate one language into another without any loss of meaning. Notice, he's not really interested in the meaning anyway. He's interested in syntactic structures, in the rules. So that's the sense in which his structuralism comes in here. But Chomsky is a startling figure in that he goes against the tide of 20th century thinking in many different ways, not least of which this leveling phenomenon, namely leveling all languages to say that they're all really the same deep down. And in many of the social sciences, the emphasis has been towards pluralism. And he is a universalist. He really is a Cartesian rationalist in his linguistic theorizing. Deductive, mathematical modeling. There is one right answer. There is one underlying universal language. And that our task as linguists is to identify the deep structure of language, to find the transformation rules among the grammars of real languages of actual languages to get down to the underlying absolute linguistic structure. This has turned out to be an extraordinarily prolific and fertile research program, which dominated linguistics in the 1960s and 70s and even into the 80s. Chomsky is a major influence, like Keynes in economics, like Einstein in physics, like Boas in anthropology, sociology, and linguistics, a major influence. And in addition to that, one must point out that his quite left-wing politics and his devotion to his critique of American foreign policy since the 1960s especially, his linguistics and his politics together have made him what some people have calculated to be the single most cited intellectual in America and quite possibly the world. So Chomsky's theories are still loom over all of linguistics, but not surprisingly perhaps in the 1980s and 1990s there began to emerge a kind of resistance to Chomsky, a critique of Chomsky. Very daring thing to do, because one characteristic of Chomsky, unlike almost all of the other people that I've mentioned, is that Chomsky will go anywhere to debate anybody who disagrees with him. Unlike his teacher Zelig Harris, who simply shrugged his shoulders at people who argued that he was wrong. Harris was a genius in his own right and a very influential linguist. But Chomsky's attitude is that if there's a major figure around, who says he's wrong, he'll go there and debate him. And he is a brilliant speaker and a brilliant debater. So Chomsky's work looms over linguistics still at the beginning of the 21st century, but there are clearly now emerging post-Chomskyan linguistic schools. Not surprisingly, one of these is, let's get semantics back in the game. We've had enough of syntactics. In fact, meaning is what linguists need to explain, how people understand the languages that they use, while de Saussure made a distinction between what he called parole and langue. Parole is the noises we make, and langue is the underlying abstract linguistic structure. Chomsky made a distinction between competence, the neurological hardwired capability, and performance, the noises that we make. But when you come right down to it, we don't want to explain langue and competence. We want to explain how people communicate using language. How is it that we learn a language? How is it that we know what we mean when we talk to one another? And from that perspective, we need to understand semantics. So semantics is back. A second thing that has come back, second theme that has come back, is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. You remember the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, based on Boas's approach to linguistics, was that each language encapsulated a way of experiencing the world. Now, a more sophisticated version of this is being defended by George Lakoff, among others, namely that languages do reflect the way we experience the world, and looking at our language as an expression of bodily awareness, looking at how language has an overwhelmingly metaphorical character, not just obvious metaphors, but that many of the central words in every language that we don't think of as metaphors are in fact metaphors, and that they derive from our biological experience, from our bodies, from the way that our senses are organized. And Lakoff, together with a number of collaborators, published many studies, and other people have done this as well, that are bringing the study of linguistics into biology, cognitive psychology, and even genetics. That is, say, looking for the genetic basis of language, which would be very consistent with Chomsky too, and studying language using the tools of cognitive psychology as well as biology. And a third line of research that has emerged after Chomsky has been to what's called relational grammars. That is to say, the study of languages that sort of does justice to, that treats equally the form and the content, the substance, the rules of a language without setting some aside. So instead of saying it's either semantics or syntax, to look at a language holistically, so to speak. And that has become one line of linguistics research trying to sort of go beyond what Chomsky taught us with regard to language. So if we look back at linguistics in the 20th century, starting from de Saussure, language as a social phenomenon, as a closed network of relationships, focused on semantics, we've come quite a long way from the behavioral view that it was essentially a psychological phenomenon to Chomsky's view that it's a neurological phenomenon, and now at the end of the 20th century trying to regroup and return to a richer conception of language as a social phenomenon.